This week on Tech Stuff Tuesday, we're going to look at subwoofer efficiency. You've seen a sensitivity spec on spec sheets, and you wonder, that's how efficient it is, and if you compare that number, that's going to be the loudest sub. So if you're going for an SPL application, the one with the highest sensitivity is going to give you the best number, or in a daily application, you go, I just want it louder, this one has higher sensitivity, so it's going to be louder. We're going to look and see if that holds true. I've already done this on mids, and we found out that that did actually apply to be true between a 6.5 and an 8-inch, where the 6.5, or Swag 6.5, had a higher efficiency rating than a Rockford Fosgate 8-inch. That was both marine rated, same application, everything. The Swag should have been louder, and it was. So we're going to see if that holds true for subs. Now what we're going to do for this test setup, I have 5 different subs. This is one of them. I have 2 8s and 3 12s, and we're using different sizes because the sensitivity number shouldn't matter what size it is. It's the same measurement process, everything across them. So we can see if everything holds true between 8s and 12s. All 5 subs have a different sensitivity rating. They're all very close. They're mostly in like 1 to 2 dB increments. I tested all these individually to get those numbers myself with my own equipment, so we're not using manufacturer specs. And out of these subs, they aren't actually commercially available, as all of them are except for one of them. So we don't have to worry about going off of manufacturer or anything on those. So we're going to use 3 different frequencies: 30 Hertz, 50 Hertz, and 70 Hertz. That way we can have a level playing field to make sure that nothing is around the FS of each sub, and they are very different. We're also going to use 3 different power levels: 10, 20, and 30 watts. And the reason we're doing that is to nail down 1 watt can be a little bit difficult. When we do that, if there's any kind of rounding on our power here, if it was 1.5 or right there, it didn't round, that could actually be over 1 dB difference in theory. So we don't want to have any type of minor issue there. Since we are using different impedance subs, we can't just set the volume and do it that way, especially with impedance rise being different for each sub. We're using a separate microphone from the Term Lab. We're only using Term Lab for power. We're using a separate microphone because this will be accurate at low SPL. The Term Lab sensor will not be. So we have our microphone right back here. It will stay there. I will only move the sub when I change it out, and it will be right in the same location. So we can get started with 10 watts on 30 Hertz. And we're going to do this for every sub to level the playing field, starting with 30 Hertz and 10 watts. $93.8. When we go to 20 watts, in theory, it should gain 3 dB. $96.5, and then last 30 watts. Now, making sure that everything is reset, we'll go to 50 Hertz and 10 watts. $99.3, now 20 watts. $101.7 and 30 watts. $103.3. Now we can go to 70 Hertz. $97.7, we'll go to 20. 100.5, and now 30. 102.0. Now with all frequencies done, we can change this to another sub and do the same thing. Now with the sub swapped out, this new sub is 83 dB sensitivity. Again, starting with 30 Hertz and 10 watts. $84.8, now 20 watts. $88.7, and now 30 watts. $90.8, going up to 50 Hertz. Now 20 watts. And 30 watts. Now at 70 Hertz. $20 watts. And 30 watts. With this sub complete, now we can swap to one of the 12s. The sensitivity on this 12 is 84 decibels, starting again with 30 Hertz and 10 watts. $107.1, and you may have noticed this was moving quite a bit. This is a very, very soft suspension. Now we'll go to 20 watts. And now 30 watts. Onto 50 Hertz. $102.3. $105.3. And 106.9. Finally, with 70 Hertz. $101.9. $105.0. And 106.8. Now, this 12 looks exactly like the other one, and it is built exactly the same, except for one change. This one has one more spider than the other one did, and this one has an 85 dB sensitivity rating. So this is 1 dB higher from the one extra spider, and that should be reflected here if that holds true, starting with 30 Hertz and 10 watts. $102.6 and going to 20 watts. 105.4, and 30 watts. (106.8). So we'll clear this and go to 50 hertz. Right at 100. (102.8). And 104.5. And 70 hertz. (100.2). (102.7). And 104.5. And the last sub, starting at 30 hertz and 10 watts. This one has an 87 dB sensitivity. (104.5). (107.6). And 109.4. Now on to 50 hertz. (105.8). (108.3). Time dialing that in. And 110.0. (104.8). (107.3). And 109.0. So that wraps up all three power levels at all three frequencies, and so far we have a lot of really good data. So let's look at that all on the same chart. This is all the data from 10 watts, and I've color coded it by frequency so you can kind of see a little bit easier how everything comes together. But you'll notice that they're also listed in order of efficiency, the same way that we metered them. So we have 80 dB at the top and 87 at the bottom, and there's a bunch in between. And if you look at every single frequency, you'll notice not a single one of them follows that same gap. So from 80 to 83, there isn't a 3 dB gain difference between them. Depending on the frequency, it's very close to the same, or 3 dB off or more in the opposite direction. So the 80 dB efficient sub at 30 hertz, 50 hertz, and 70 hertz is all louder than the sub that is 83 dB efficient. And this is just with 10 watts. We have more power that we can look at as well. If you look at all of the other subs, we have a similar story. We have different frequencies that have a very different result in output. And the reason for that, the sensitivity rating is done at less than 1 watt or around 1 watt. When we apply power to it, all of that changes. That sensitivity is taken at its most efficient. That's going to be the resonant frequency. That's why we did this at different frequencies. So you can see that it's not a cross bandwidth average or anything like that. Different frequencies are going to be very, very different. The most apparent thing being with sub number 3, and that was the first 12-inch that was extremely loose, and that's why at 30 hertz it's so much louder. We're displacing so much more air. The FS of that sub is, I think, below 30 hertz, so it's right around there. So it's going to do a whole lot more, but it's also extremely loose. Now at the 50 and 70 hertz, it falls way, way off, because at the 30 hertz, we can get it to move so much more. On sub number 5, that is the highest efficiency. It's not the loudest number that we've seen at 10 hertz. In fact, there's 3 dB difference. Sub number 5, that's the highest sensitivity number, is almost 3 dB quieter at 30 hertz as the 3 dB allegedly quieter. So there's quite a bit of difference there at 30 hertz. That gap is closed at 50 hertz. It actually is 3.5 dB louder at 50 hertz. At 70 hertz, it's 2.9. So in those instances, it actually is accurate, but at 30 hertz, it's definitely not. And again, we're talking at the 10 watt range. We still have the 20 and 30 watt to compare as well. So what you can tell from all of this data so far is it's not corresponding to a higher sensitivity number is a louder sub. It is frequency dependent, but it's also not consistent from sub to sub. So let's look at 20 watts and see what difference we have. At 20 watts, nearly every measurement is right around 3 dB higher with 20 watts versus 10 watts. And theoretically, you should gain 3 dB from power. So all of that is matching up. We're adding power and we're getting 3 dB. Now this is not going to be exponential. There's going to be a point where we reach mechanical limits or getting near it, whereas one will and one will not, so that will close that gap. So we can't go 100% off of that. But that is something that we're seeing between 10 and 20 watts. That also means that all of our prior data showing that one is not necessarily louder than the other at a given sensitivity holds true. Now at the 30 watt area, we should theoretically gain 1.5 dB from 20 watts. And we are seeing that for the most part. Again, all of this is holding true on theoretical gains from power, which will only work to a certain point. However, this is also confirming again that if you have 80 dB sensitivity and it's 98.2 at 30 hertz, but the next one is 83 dB, there was 8 dB difference at 30 hertz for a 3 dB higher sensitivity rating, but it was 8 dB quieter. Across the board, the 83 dB sensitive sub is actually lower than the 80 dB. And we can confirm this again in an enclosure where we can see what that difference is in a real world application. But even just from the spec, there is a huge difference there on what theoretically sub number 2 should be louder if sensitivity was accurate. Then if you look between sub number 2 and sub number 3, there is 1 dB efficiency difference. That's going from an 8 to a 12. 1 dB difference in the sensitivity. However, there's 10 dB difference in output at 30 hertz. There's 5.9 dB difference at 50 hertz. There's 5.4 dB difference at 70 hertz. But the sensitivity is only 1 dB different. This trend continues on everything. This is very hard data concluding you cannot go off of sensitivity to determine if a sub is going to be louder than another. And remember, all of this is in free air, and some of you are going to complain that it's not in an enclosure and it's not in a car. So I guess you know what this means. We're going to Vegas! Oh, we're not going to Vegas. We're going to the workshop. And here is our test setup. We have America 12K making 10, 20, and 30 watts. I know it's way overkill, but that's what we're using. It's what's already in the car. We have our single 12 box. We're going to use this for the 312s. We have a different box for the 8s. Now I know what you're thinking. They're not in the same box, or it's not the optimal box for each sub, or any other number of things regarding the car, the tuning, the box, the sub. The argument is sensitivity is the defiant thing on what makes it louder. So it shouldn't matter what box it's in, as long as it's in the same box, which sub should be louder. We're going to see if that holds true or not. Both boxes, the 8-inch box and the 12-inch box, are tuned pretty high. I am going to play the same 3 frequencies, 30, 50, and 70 hertz. None of those are the vehicle peak, so that's kind of irrelevant for what the actual number is here, but they're in the same box, playing the same frequencies on the same power, and it should yield a higher sensitivity if sensitivity is the defining factor. Each one should be louder. So we'll get started, starting from the highest to the lowest, the 87 dB 12. Now 50 hertz. And now 70 hertz. That was pretty interesting in that we had 9 and 10 dB difference between 50 and 70 hertz and 30 and 70 hertz, and 30 and 50 were pretty close together on that one. That's some very good first out data. Our next 12 is going to be the 84 dB 12, and theoretically all of these numbers should be 3 dB down across the board. So let's get the sub swapped out and find out. Now this is the 85 dB 12. There were 2 that were identical, short of one having one more spider. This is the one that has one more spider. If sensitivity is correct, it should be 2 dB quieter across the board. No variance. So let's get to testing on this one. I'm a little bit surprised at the 30 hertz results. Maybe we'll see a difference here at 50 and 70. I'm guessing that the box tuning is really what's holding that back. But we were 3 dB quieter than the other sub. Now we'll move on to 50 hertz. The gap on that is certainly getting closer. Now we brought that down to around 1 dB difference across the board, almost exactly 1 dB. Remember, theoretically, it should be 2 dB quieter. We'll move on to 70 hertz. Once we got to 70 hertz, we're right in the 2 to 3 dB difference on that one. So we're going to repeat the test again on the next 12, which is 84 dB sensitive, and it should be 1 dB off. Remember, we're not even changing motor force, coil, anything. It's an identical sub with 1 spider difference, so there should be 1 dB difference across the board. Kicking off the 84 dB 12 with 30 hertz and 10 watts. Now 50 hertz and 10 watts. And now 70 hertz. Now, if you were paying attention there, we had some variances between 1/10, 2/10. What we did not see was 1 dB. There was never 1 full dB difference anywhere in there. So we're not really on a good track here for proving that sensitivity is definitive in what it is. Now we're going to move on to the 8s, which means there's going to be an enclosure change. Now with the 8 box in, we're going to start with our 83 dB Sundown E8 V2, I think it is, or maybe a 3. I don't remember. This one has a stiffer splitter pack on it, so it should do quite a bit better at the higher frequencies than the lower frequencies. But remember, none of that is supposed to matter because this is supposed to be based solely on sensitivity. So 83 dB, this should be 1 dB quieter than the last 12 that we tested. We're going to start with 30 hertz and 10 watts and find out. $50 hertz. And 70 hertz. If you were paying attention, this sub that's supposed to be 1 dB quieter is 2 dB louder. That's a huge difference. I'm going to test the other 8-inch. We'll see the results that we get. Remember, this other 8-inch is 80 dB efficient. It is 3 dB quieter, allegedly, than the one that we just tested. And we'll see if it's any louder. We'll look at the results and we'll talk about our findings. Now, if you like everything that we're doing here and you're new to the channel, thanks for watching, and consider lightly caressing that subscribe button right down there. So this SA8 V2, that again is not stock, this is not how you would have bought it. It's also 80 dB. It is the lowest sensitivity rating of every sub that we've tried. So this should, by quite a bit, be the lowest numbers. In comparison to the Lowballer 12 prototype, it should be 7 dB quieter. So let's check that. We're going to start with 30 hertz, 10 watts. Hertz. And 70 hertz. Interestingly enough, we had about a 3 dB difference between these two subs at the different frequencies and at these power levels across the board. Now, I know from much higher power testing that this is not going to give us the same result, but for this application, this test, and keeping everything consistent, we did actually see a very similar result of the sensitivity in relation to actual in-enclosure testing. I'm going to leave each of these slides up here for several seconds, and feel free to pause it and look the data over so you can kind of see what exactly is happening at 10 watts, 20 watts, and 30 watts. But the general consensus here is there is no correlation that is a direct relationship to the sensitivity and how it comes out. Even in an enclosure, in a car, the same exact testing that we did for air, there's nothing definitive that the sensitivity number is going to be the result that you have in a real world application. So what exactly did we learn here? Well, we learned that the pro audio guys are going to be triggered. I keep hearing from them that the sub sensitivity matters and that's going to be the loudest sub and that's the one you have to use, but we just showed that that isn't the case. We saw it in free air, we saw it in an enclosure, we saw it in use in a real world application, short of being 10, 20, and 30 watts, which generally isn't the power you're going to be using. There seems to be absolutely no correlation directly to the sensitivity numbers between sub to sub. There are a lot of other factors: motor force, the resonant frequency of the sub, the dynamics of the spiders themselves. There's a ton of other factors that go into that, and all of those should be looked at. Probably the last thing you should look at is the sensitivity. I know from previous testing that of the two 8s, one of them being an 80 dB sub and the other one being an 83 dB, the 80 dB sub is way louder. Power for power, once you get more power on it, that gap gets closed up, and we're talking in the hundreds of watts. And then once you go well beyond that, the other is way, way louder, but that also comes from power. From the application that I have it in, it needs to take the power. Overall, it's louder. You can't just go off that sensitivity number. So make sure when you're looking at sensitivity, if you're really looking at that for some reason, you're looking at 1 watt per meter or 2.83 volts, and you're comparing the same spec. 2.83 volts is not necessarily going to be the same as 1 watt per meter. So use the same parameters if you're going to compare them, but I don't recommend comparing them. There is no significance on how loud it's going to be in a real world application. Look at all of the other factors of the sub. Everything but just the sensitivity. Make sure you subscribe to us. Hit the notification bell down below. We also have links for our Instagram, Facebook, and our website, emfcaraudio.com, in the description below. We have the full line of Sundown Audio products: Excess Power, SBC, and EMF Audio. If you'd like to argue with somebody about what I've allegedly done wrong in this video, why everything I've said isn't true, comment below and argue with somebody that isn't me, because I don't care. I'll see you again in another Tech Stuff Tuesday.